The gunshot cracked through the Nebraska plains like thunder, sending Tom Mackenzie's horse into a violent rear that nearly threw him from the saddle. His weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as Bandit's hooves hit the muddy ground with a splash, the storm having turned the prairie into a treacherous maze of hidden gullies and slick grass. Tom's sightless eyes stared ahead into the eternal darkness that had been his world for 3 long years, but his other senses painted a vivid picture of danger closing in around him. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered to his mount, his voice barely audible above the howling wind that carried with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and something else, something that made his stomach churn. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the rain-soaked earth, and beneath it all, the faint fragrance of jasmine that seemed impossibly out of place in this godforsaken corner of the frontier. His calloused fingers moved instinctively to the Colt .45 holstered at his hip, muscle memory from his seeing days guiding his movements with practiced precision. Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by screams that pierced through the storm like glass shards. The voices were distinctly feminine, high-pitched with terror, and speaking in a rapid-fire language that Tom recognized as Chinese from his days working the railroad construction camps before his accident. What in God's name were Chinese women doing out here in the middle of nowhere, and who was shooting at them? Tom guided Bandit toward the sounds, his heart hammering against his ribs as the full weight of what he might be walking into settled over him like a burial shroud. Everyone knew about what had happened in Rock Springs just months ago, how white miners had slaughtered dozens of Chinese workers in a frenzy of racial hatred that had spread like wildfire across the West. The newspapers had called it justifiable, the politicians had looked the other way, and decent folks had whispered about it in hushed tones over their Sunday dinners. "Please. Help us. They kill my sister." The words came in broken English, carried on the wind like a prayer to a deaf god. Tom felt his jaw clench as he recognized the desperation in that voice, the same hopeless terror he had heard in his own throat the night the cattle had trampled him and stolen his sight forever. No matter what color their skin was, no matter where they came from, terror sounded the same in every language. He slipped from the saddle, his boots squelching in the mud as he moved toward the voices with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to navigate by sound and instinct. The rain hammered against his leather coat, each drop like a tiny fist pounding against his shoulders, but Tom pushed forward through the curtain of water and wind. His free hand swept back and forth in front of him, searching for obstacles, while his ears tracked every sound with the intensity of a hunting wolf. "I can see them, Li Hua. 3 men with guns, they come closer." The voice belonged to an older woman, probably mid-20s from the sound of it, with the kind of authority that suggested she was used to being in charge. Her English was better than her companion's, but still heavily accented with the musical tones of Cantonese. Tom could hear 2 sets of feet splashing through puddles, moving away from him toward what sounded like a rocky outcropping about 50 yards to his left. "Shut your yellow mouths." The new voice was pure American, rough with whiskey and hatred, the kind of voice that belonged to men who burned crosses and lynched anyone who looked different. "You think you can steal from white folks and run? Think again, you heathen whores." Tom's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Horse thieves, maybe, or claim jumpers, but more likely just men who saw 2 vulnerable Chinese women as easy prey in a territory where killing a Chinese person carried about as much legal consequence as shooting a rabid dog. The Exclusion Act of 1882 had made it clear that Chinese weren't welcome in America, and too many men took that as a license to do whatever they pleased to any Asian they encountered. The sound of boots splashing through mud grew closer, and Tom could make out at least 3 distinct sets of footsteps moving with the confident swagger of men who believed themselves to be the hunters rather than the hunted. One of them was dragging something heavy, probably supplies stolen from the women, while another kept up a steady stream of profanity that would have made a saloon girl blush. The third remained silent, but his footsteps had the measured cadence of a man who knew how to kill and had done it before. "Found M." The triumphant shout came from directly ahead of Tom, maybe 30 feet away. "Little yellow birds trying to hide behind them rocks. Come on out, ladies, we ain't gonna hurt you much." The laughter that followed was like broken glass scraping against stone, devoid of any human warmth or mercy. Tom moved faster now, his boots finding purchase on the rocky ground as he closed the distance. His fingers wrapped around the grip of his Colt, thumb working the hammer back with a soft click that was swallowed by the storm. He had been many things in his 32 years on this earth: cowboy, ranch hand, drifter, and drunk, but he had never been the kind of man who could walk away when innocent people were about to be murdered. "You boys might want to reconsider your next move," Tom called out, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. He kept his gun low but ready, pointing it in the general direction of the voices. "Seems like you've got yourselves outnumbered here." The laughter died instantly, replaced by the sound of boots shifting in mud as the three men turned to face this unexpected threat. Tom could practically feel their confusion as they tried to process what they were seeing: a lone cowboy, obviously blind from the way his eyes failed to track their movements, standing in the middle of a storm with his gun drawn like some kind of avenging angel. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them said, his voice thick with amusement. "Looks like we got ourselves a blind hero, boys. What you gonna do, mister? Shoot at the sound of our voices?" More laughter, but this time it had an edge of nervousness to it. Even the stupidest men knew that a desperate man with a gun was dangerous, regardless of whether he could see. Tom smiled grimly, rain streaming down his face like tears. "That's exactly what I'm gonna do, friend. And at this distance, I don't need to see you to put a bullet between your eyes. Sound travels real clear on a night like this." He shifted slightly, angling his body to present a smaller target while keeping his gun trained on the cluster of voices. "Now, why don't you gentlemen mount up and ride on out of here before someone gets themselves permanently horizontal?" The silence stretched out like a piano wire, broken only by the drumming of rain against rock and the harsh breathing of frightened people. Tom could sense the three men exchanging glances, weighing their options, trying to decide if a blind cowboy was worth the risk of catching a bullet. Behind them, he could hear the two Chinese women whispering to each other in their native tongue, their voices so low he could barely make out the musical cadence of their words. "Mister, you don't know what you're getting yourself into here," the leader said finally, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "These here Chinese gals are thieves and murderers. They killed a white man back in Omaha, stole his money and his horses. We're just bringing them to justice, is all." Tom's finger tightened on the trigger as he processed this information. It could be true, desperation drove people to do things they never thought possible. But something about the way the women had screamed, the pure terror in their voices, told him these men were lying through their teeth. Besides, even if the women were guilty of something, frontier justice administered by drunken vigilantes usually ended in rape and murder, not any kind of real justice. "That so?" Tom replied, his voice conversational despite the tension crackling through the air like lightning. "Well, then I reckon you boys won't mind waiting until we can get the sheriff involved. Last I heard, Judge Parker down in Fort Smith was real particular about due process, especially when it comes to hanging folks." He paused, letting that sink in. "Course, if you're lying to me, and these women are just convenient targets for your particular brand of entertainment, well, then we got ourselves a different kind of problem entirely." The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of impending violence along with the storm clouds that seemed to press down on the prairie like a giant's fist. Tom could feel the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on him, 3 filled with murderous intent and 2 with desperate hope. His own world remained locked in eternal night, but his other senses painted a picture more vivid than any sunset he had ever seen with his eyes. "You're making a mistake, cowboy," the leader growled, but Tom caught the slight tremor in his voice. "These ain't no innocent ladies. They're killers, and they're gonna kill again if we let 'em go." From behind the rocks came a voice, clear and defiant despite the fear that edged every word. "He lie. We never kill nobody. We run from bad men in San Francisco, from marriage we no want." The accent was thick, but the English was precise enough to convey the desperation behind it. "Please, mister, they want to hurt us bad." Tom heard the shuffle of feet as one of the men tried to circle around to his left, probably hoping to get a clear shot while his attention was divided. But 3 years of blindness had taught Tom to track multiple sounds simultaneously, and he swung his gun toward the movement without hesitation. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, friend," Tom said quietly. "I may not be able to see you, but I can hear a prairie dog sneeze at 100 yards. You take another step in that direction, and you'll be meeting your maker a lot sooner than you planned." The footsteps stopped, and Tom heard a muttered curse followed by the distinctive sound of a gun being cocked. the situation was about to explode into violence, and Tom knew that once the shooting started, innocent people were going to die. He had to make a choice, trust his instincts about the women or let three armed men have their way with what might be cold-blooded killers. But as another terrified whisper in Chinese drifted across the storm, Tom made his decision. Whatever these women had done, whatever crimes they might have committed, they didn't deserve to be hunted down like animals by vigilantes who saw justice as nothing more than an excuse for brutality. "Here's how this is going to work," Tom announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of facing down angry bulls and meaner men. "You three are going to mount up and ride out of here right now, and these ladies are coming with me. We'll sort out who's telling the truth when we get to the next town and can find ourselves a proper lawman. Like hell we are." The explosion of rage came from directly in front of him, followed by the sound of a gun being raised. Tom's finger found the trigger of his Colt just as lightning split the sky above them, illuminating the prairie in stark black and white for one brief, brilliant moment. In that instant of light, Tom's world exploded into chaos as three guns fired simultaneously, their muzzle flashes creating their own lightning against the storm-dark sky. The thunder that followed seemed to go on forever, mixing with screams and the sound of bodies hitting the muddy ground. When the echoes finally died away, the only sounds left were the drumming of rain and the harsh breathing of survivors. Tom stood perfectly still, his smoking gun still raised, trying to piece together what had happened from the sounds around him. He could hear someone groaning softly to his right, probably one of the gunmen, but the other two were ominously silent. Behind the rocks, he caught the sound of rapid breathing and whispered prayers in Chinese, which meant at least one of the women had survived the gunfight. "Ladies," Tom called out, his voice hoarse from the gunpowder smoke. "Are either of you hurt?" "We okay," came the reply, shakier now but still defiant. "You save us." Thank you so much." Tom holstered his gun and made his way carefully toward the rocks, his boots splashing through puddles that might have been rainwater or might have been something else entirely. As he rounded the outcropping, he caught a stronger whiff of that jasmine perfume, mixed now with the metallic scent of fierce sweat and something else, something that made his nostrils flare with recognition. "My name is Tom Mackenzie," he said, stopping a few feet away from where the voices had come from. "I'm going to help you ladies get out of here, but first I need to know, are either of you bleeding?" There was a moment of rapid conversation in Chinese, followed by the sound of fabric rustling as the women examined themselves for wounds. Tom heard the soft splash of footsteps approaching him, and then a delicate hand touched his arm. "I am Mei Lin," the older voice said, and Tom could feel her looking up at him in the darkness. "This is my sister Li Hua. We are not hurt, but we are very grateful. You are a brave man to help strangers in storm." Tom nodded, but something about her voice nagged at him. There was an undertone there, something that didn't quite match the gratitude in her words. Before he could analyze it further, the younger woman spoke up from behind her sister. "Mr. Tom," Li Hua said, her voice softer and more musical than her sister's, "you are a strong man, brave man. You save our lives. In China, when man save woman's life, she belonged to him. We have no family here, no money, no place to go. Maybe you need wives?" Tom felt his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. In all the scenarios he had imagined for how this night might end, being propositioned for marriage by two Chinese women he had just rescued from certain death hadn't made the list. He opened his mouth to respond, but Mei Lin beat him to it. "Li Hua, you speak too fast." There was sharp irritation in her voice now, and Tom caught the sound of fabric swishing as she turned to face her sister. "I am older, I speak English better, I know more about American ways. If anyone should marry the Honorable Mr. Mackenzie, it should be me. I can cook, I can clean, I can take care of his needs. You too bossy?" Li Hua shot back, her voice rising with indignation. "You always think you know everything, but you know nothing about men. I am prettier, I am younger, I make better wife for strong cowboy. Besides, he saved both of us, but I speak to him first." Tom stood there in the pouring rain, listening to two women argue over who had the right to marry him, and wondered if maybe he should have just kept riding and minded his own business. The night had started with a simple ride back to his cabin, and now he was standing in a field full of dead men while two Chinese refugees debated the finer points of frontier matrimony. But as the argument continued in a mixture of English and rapid-fire Chinese, Tom began to notice other things. The way Mei Lin's voice carried a subtle authority that spoke of education and privilege. The way Li Hua's accent seemed to shift slightly when she got excited, becoming more refined before dropping back into the broken English she had been using. And underneath it all, that nagging scent that had been bothering him since he first approached the rocks. It wasn't jasmine perfume at all. It was opium, the distinctive sweet bitter smell that clung to the clothes and hair of anyone who spent time in the smoking parlors of Chinatowns across the West. Tom had smelled it often enough during his railroad days to recognize it anywhere, and it raised questions about these women that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. As thunder rolled across the prairie again and the storm showed no signs of letting up, Tom realized that rescuing Mei Lin and Li Hua might have been the easy part. Figuring out what to do with them, and what secrets they were hiding beneath their grateful smiles and marriage proposals, was going to be a whole different kind of challenge altogether. The ride to Tom's cabin took the better part of 2 hours through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. With the storm still raging overhead and 3 people sharing 2 horses, the journey became a test of endurance that pushed both man and beast to their limits. Tom rode Bandit while Mei Lin sat behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her body pressed against his back in a way that spoke of desperation rather than intimacy. Li Hua rode the dead men's horses, a sturdy mare that Tom had commandeered from the scene of the gunfight, and she followed the sound of Bandit's hoofbeats through the darkness with the skill of someone accustomed to traveling by night. The conversation during the ride was sporadic, broken by the need to navigate washes swollen with rainwater and rocky outcroppings that could break a horse's leg if approached carelessly. But what Tom heard during those brief exchanges painted a picture that grew more complex with each passing mile. The sisters spoke to each other in rapid Cantonese when they thought he couldn't hear them over the storm, but sound carried differently at night, and Tom's trained ears caught fragments that troubled him deeply. They weren't just refugees from an arranged marriage, that much became clear from their whispered conversations. References to the package and what we took from the ship suggested these women were carrying something valuable, something that might explain why 3 armed men had been hunting them through the storm. More disturbing were the frequent mentions of the organization and our debts in San Francisco, terms that Tom associated with the Chinese criminal societies that controlled everything from opium smuggling to prostitution in the growing Chinatowns of the West. When they finally reached Tom's cabin, a modest log structure nestled against a rocky bluff about 12 miles north of the nearest town, the storm was beginning to weaken but showed no signs of stopping completely. Tom dismounted first, his boots hitting the muddy ground with a wet squelch as he turned to help Mei Lin down from the horse. Her hands were ice cold when they touched his, and he could feel her shivering through the soaked silk of her dress. "This is your home?" Li Hua asked, and Tom caught the note of disappointment in her voice as she surveyed the humble cabin. It was a far cry from the grand ranch house she had probably been expecting, just a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed built into the corner. The walls were chinked with mud and moss, and the roof showed signs of recent repairs where winter storms had torn away shingles. "It's not much," Tom admitted, feeling around for the leather latch on the door, "but it's dry and warm, and that's more than we had out there in the storm." He pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately moving toward the fireplace where he kept his kindling dry in a wooden box beside the hearth. His movements were sure and practiced, the result of 3 years of living in darkness, and within minutes he had coaxed a small flame to life among the dry wood. As the fire began to grow, casting dancing shadows across the log walls, Tom became aware of his guests moving around the cabin with the careful steps of people trying to take inventory without appearing too obvious about it. He heard Mei Lin's sharp intake of breath as she discovered the modest collection of belongings that represented everything Tom owned in the world, a few changes of clothes hanging from pegs on the wall, some basic cooking utensils arranged on shelves beside the fireplace, and a small collection of books that he could no longer read but couldn't bring himself to throw away. "You live here alone?" Li Hua asked, and Tom caught something calculating in her voice that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "No wife, no family?" "Just me and the horses," Tom replied, stirring the fire with a poker until the flames leaped higher. "My family's all back in Texas, and I haven't seen them since before my accident." He paused, listening to the subtle sounds his guests were making as they explored the cabin. "What about you ladies? You mentioned fleeing from arranged marriages, but there's got to be more to the story than that. Men don't usually chase women with guns just to drag them back to a wedding." The silence that followed was pregnant with tension, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain against the cabin's windows. Tom heard the rustle of wet silk as the two women exchanged glances, and when Mei Lin finally spoke, her voice carried a careful note of rehearsed innocence. "In San Francisco, there are men who think they own Chinese women like property," she said, moving closer to the fire so that Tom could hear the water dripping from her clothes onto the wooden floor. "My sister and I worked in restaurant, saving money to bring our family from China. But the man who owns the building, he decides we should marry his friends instead of working. When we refuse, he sends men to force us." It was a plausible story, the kind of tale that played out in Chinatowns across the country as Chinese immigrants struggled against both poverty and prejudice. But something about the way Mei Lin told it, the careful modulation of her voice and the precision of her English, suggested she was more educated and sophisticated than a simple restaurant worker would likely be. And there was still that persistent smell of opium that clung to both women despite their soaking in the storm. Li Hua chose that moment to step closer to the fire, and in the flickering light, Tom caught his first real glimpse of his unexpected guests. Even without being able to see clearly, he could sense that these were not the peasant women their story suggested. Their posture, the way they moved, even the quality of their rain-soaked clothing spoke of money and refinement that didn't match their tale of humble restaurant work. "Mr. Tom," Li Hua said, her voice taking on a softer, more seductive quality, "you are a kind man to help us. In China, we learn that kindness must be repaid with kindness. You save our lives, give us shelter, feed us. We have no money to pay you, but we can offer ourselves as wives. You choose which one you like best, and we make you very happy man." Tom felt his eyebrows climb toward his hairline for the second time that night. The casual way Li Hua discussed marriage as a business transaction was startling even by frontier standards, but what caught his attention was the sharp hiss of displeasure that came from Mei Lin's direction. When the older woman spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Li Hua speaks without thinking, as always," Mei Lin said, and Tom could hear her moving to place herself between her sister and the fire. "I am older sister, more experienced in ways of world. If Mr. Mackenzie chooses wife, he should choose woman who can take care of him properly, not silly girl who knows nothing about keeping house or pleasing husband." "I know plenty about pleasing husband," Li Hua shot back, her voice rising with indignation. "You think because you older you know everything, but you know nothing about love. You so busy trying to be boss of everyone, you forget how to be woman." Tom listened to this exchange with growing bewilderment, wondering how he had managed to go from a simple ride home to being fought over by two Chinese women who seemed to view marriage as some kind of commercial transaction. But beneath his confusion, a nagging worry was taking root. The more he listened to these women talk, the more convinced he became that their story was full of holes, and that whatever trouble they were running from was probably a lot more serious than arranged marriages. The sound of fabric rustling drew his attention back to his guests, and Tom realized that both women were beginning to remove their wet clothes by the fire. In the frontier, modesty often took a back seat to survival, and hypothermia was a real danger after spending hours in a cold rain. Still, the casual way they began undressing suggested a familiarity with male attention that didn't quite fit with their claims of innocence. "Ladies," Tom said carefully, turning his back to give them privacy while he rummaged through his belongings for dry clothes they could wear, "while you're getting dried off, maybe you could tell me more about those men who were chasing you. They mentioned something about murders and theft, and I'd like to know if I'm going to have more trouble riding up to my door tonight." The rustling stopped abruptly, and Tom heard the two women exchange rapid whispers in Chinese before Mei Lin answered in a voice that was just a little too controlled. "Those men were liars and criminals. They wanted to hurt us, so they tell lies to make you go away. We never kill nobody, never steal nothing. We are good women, honest women." But even as she spoke, Tom caught the sound of something small and metallic being carefully moved across the wooden floor, as if one of the women was hiding something while his back was turned. When he turned back around, extending two of his own shirts for them to use as makeshift dresses, he noticed that both women had positioned themselves strategically near their discarded clothes, as if guarding something hidden in the folds of wet silk. "Well," Tom said, settling into the chair beside his table and trying to process everything he had learned in the past few hours, "I reckon we're all stuck here until the storm passes and the roads dry out enough for travel. That'll give us time to figure out what to do next, and maybe get some straight answers about what kind of trouble you ladies are really in." Li Hua, now wrapped in one of Tom's oversized shirts that hung on her small frame like a dress, moved to perch on the edge of the bed with what Tom was beginning to recognize as calculated charm. "Mr. Tom, you worry too much about trouble. We are safe now, warm and dry in your home. Tomorrow, we can talk about marriage, about making you happy man with good Chinese wife who cook and clean and take care of all your needs." Mei Lin made a sound of disgust from her position near the fireplace, where she was hanging their wet clothes on makeshift lines strung between the ceiling beams. "Li Hua thinks marriage is just about cooking and bedroom, but real marriage is about partnership, about helping husband become successful man. I can read and write English, I understand American business. With me as wife, you could buy more land, raise cattle, become important man in territory." Tom rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building behind his eyes as he listened to the two women discuss his future as if he were livestock being bid on at an auction. The truth was, he had never given much thought to marriage since his accident. What woman would want to tie herself to a blind cowboy who lived in a one-room cabin and owned nothing but a horse and a handful of personal belongings? But as the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Tom found himself studying his unexpected guests more carefully. Both women were beautiful, that much was obvious even to his limited vision, but there was something else about them that kept nagging at him. The way they moved, the casual familiarity with which they discussed intimate matters, and above all, that persistent smell of opium that seemed to follow them like a shadow. It was nearly dawn when Tom finally dozed off in his chair, lulled by the dying storm and the steady breathing of the two women who had claimed his bed without asking. But even in sleep, part of his mind remained alert, and he was awakened just after sunrise by the sound of voices outside his cabin. Male voices, speaking in low, urgent tones as they approached the door. Tom's hand found his gun automatically as he came fully awake, and across the room he heard both women freeze in terror at the sound of footsteps on his wooden porch. When the knock came, firm and authoritative, it was Mei Lin who whispered the words that confirmed Tom's growing suspicions about his mysterious guests. "They found us," she said, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn gloom. "The Tong has sent more men. They will kill us all if they find what we took from the ship." As the knocking grew more insistent and Tom heard the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather that marked armed men preparing for trouble, he realized that saving two Chinese women from rape and murder had been the easy part of his night. Now he was about to discover what Mei Lin and Li Hua had really stolen, and why the Chinese criminal organization known as the Tong was willing to kill anyone who stood in their way of getting it back. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice that carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We know you're in there, Mackenzie. Send out the women, and nobody else has to get hurt." Tom gripped his gun tighter and wondered how many more men he was going to have to kill before this was over. But as he looked at the two terrified women huddled on his bed, both of them clutching something small and precious against their chests, he knew there was no turning back now. Whatever secrets Mei Lin and Li Hua were hiding, whatever stolen treasure had brought death to his doorstep, Tom was committed to seeing this through to the end. Outside, the voices grew louder and more impatient, and Tom heard the distinct sound of rifles being cocked. Dawn was breaking over the Nebraska prairie, but for Tom Mackenzie and his mysterious Chinese guests, the real darkness was just beginning.